After 12 years of running my father's company, I finally made it worth $75 million. At a family dinner, my dad looked at me and said, smiling, "Your brother will take over now." My heart sank, but I smiled back. The next morning at work changed everything. I still remember the way my father smiled that night, his hand resting proudly on my brother's shoulder, as if he had already made up his mind long before speaking the words that would change everything. "Your brother will take over now." I felt my stomach drop, but years of practice kept my face composed. I smiled back, as if his words didn't pierce straight through me, as if they weren't unraveling 12 years of my life's work in an instant. The dining room was filled with the clinking of glasses, the quiet hum of conversations between extended family and close business associates. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was a celebration, a moment meant to honor everything we had built, everything I had built. My father had started Harper & Company when I was just a child, a modest logistics business that barely stayed afloat in its early years. I grew up watching him struggle to keep it alive, working late nights, sacrificing family vacations, always chasing one more contract to make ends meet. When I was 24, fresh out of business school, he finally let me step in, though I had to fight for that opportunity. And I had done more than just step in. I had transformed Harper & Company from a struggling regional logistics firm into a national powerhouse, expanding operations, securing million-dollar contracts, integrating cutting-edge technology. What was once a small, nearly bankrupt company now stood as an industry leader worth $75 million. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. My father had already decided. My brother, Ethan, would be taking over, not me. A slow ripple of approval spread around the table, murmurs of congratulations directed at Ethan. I watched as he lowered his gaze, feigning modesty, though I knew better. Ethan had never been truly invested in the business. He had spent the last decade hopping from one failed venture to another, never quite finding his footing. He wasn't interested in logistics. He wasn't interested in operations. But he was interested in power. I had spent 12 years proving myself, building Harper & Company from the ground up, making every hard decision, every late-night strategy call, every contract negotiation. Ethan had done none of it. And yet, here we were. Still, I swallowed my emotions. I had learned long ago that in this family, showing pain was weakness. I reached for my wine glass, steadying my hand before lifting it. "Smile, Lisa, smile." "To Ethan," I said, my voice smooth, controlled. The guests raised their glasses, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. My mother cast me a glance from across the table, an unreadable expression, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, she had always seen the effort I put in, but she wouldn't interfere. She never did. Then there was my father, grinning with that same unwavering confidence, completely unaware that his choice had set something in motion. Ethan met my gaze from across the table, a smirk barely hidden at the corner of his lips. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just my father's decision. Ethan had been waiting for this. He had positioned himself carefully, playing the role of the dutiful son who had finally found his calling. And my father, ever the traditionalist, saw no flaw in his logic. A son should inherit the empire. A daughter, well, a daughter's efforts were always considered temporary. A footnote in history, no matter how hard she fought to prove otherwise. But what they didn't realize, what neither of them had accounted for, was that I had spent 12 years not just building a company, but fortifying my position within it. And tomorrow morning, they would learn exactly what that meant. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed every sacrifice I had made for Harper & Company. The late nights, the missed birthdays, the relationships that crumbled under the weight of my ambition. I had given everything for this company, and now they expected me to simply step aside? They had underestimated me. By 3 a.m., I was in my home office, my fingers moving quickly across my keyboard. Every contract, every share, every executive agreement. I knew the inner workings of this company better than anyone, Ethan thought he was walking into an easy transition, that by next week his name would be on the office door, his position secured. What he didn't know was that while my father had been busy with public appearances and my brother had been busy pretending to learn the business, I had been securing something far more valuable: control. At exactly 8:45 a.m., I stepped into Harper & Company headquarters, just like I had for the past 12 years. The same walls, the same polished floors, the same hum of efficiency as employees settled into their routines. But today was different. Today, I wasn't walking into my office. I was walking into a battlefield. The reception area was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. They knew. The whispers had already started. The news of my father's announcement at dinner had spread like wildfire. Employees glanced at me with hesitant expressions, avoiding direct eye contact, unsure of where their loyalty should lie. I didn't acknowledge them. I walked with confidence, my heels clicking against the marble floors, my posture unwavering. Never let them see you shaken. I entered my office, shutting the door behind me. I had precisely 15 minutes before my father and Ethan arrived, thinking they would step into their new positions as CEO and heir apparent. 15 minutes before everything they had planned crumbled in front of them. I sat at my desk, inhaling deeply, then powered on my computer. The screen illuminated with a list of confidential documents and contracts, ones they had never thought to look at, ones they had assumed didn't matter. I pulled up my ownership records. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a second before I clicked on the file labeled Executive Shareholders Agreement. And then I waited. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a sharp knock at my door. I didn't bother responding. The door swung open, and in walked my father and Ethan, both exuding confidence. His inborn, Ethan's carefully manufactured. My father strode in like a king surveying his kingdom, while Ethan, dressed in an expensive navy suit, gave me a smug, triumphant grin. It took everything in me not to laugh. "Lisa," my father said, in his usual authoritative voice, as if he were doing me a favor by acknowledging me. "I assume you're aware of the transition happening today?" Transition. Interesting choice of words. "I'm aware," I said smoothly, leaning back in my chair. I glanced at Ethan, whose smirk only widened. "Good," my father continued, nodding as if we were all in agreement. "Ethan will be stepping in as the new CEO. We'll need you to help with the handover. Get him familiar with the operations before you officially move on." I arched an eyebrow. "Move on?" I echoed, feigning confusion. "Dad, I think you're mistaken about something." His face twitched in irritation. He was used to my compliance, my ability to quietly fall in line. He wasn't prepared for this. "Lisa," he said, voice tight, as if speaking to a child. "This isn't up for debate. We've already made the decision." I smiled then, a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I know, Dad," I said softly. "The thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision." Ethan let out a low scoff, shaking his head. "Lisa, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do this the easy way." I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the remote control and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up with a document, the same one I had been reviewing earlier. Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed. August 17th, 2015, signatories. Lisa Harper, James Harper, father, Ethan Harper. My father's face paled slightly. I turned to Ethan. "Do you even know what this document is?" He crossed his arms, shifting in discomfort. "A shareholders agreement?" he guessed. I nodded. "Yes." "And do you know what it says?" I tapped the screen, highlighting a crucial clause. This document was drafted when Harper & Company was restructuring. It clearly states that any transfer of executive power, such as appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of all majority shareholders. I met my father's eyes. "And I, Dad, hold 60% of the company's shares." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's expression hardened. "That's impossible," Ethan muttered, stepping forward to examine the document. "Actually, it's very possible," I said smoothly. "You see, over the years, while you were busy failing at every startup you touched, and Dad was busy playing the role of business patriarch, I was doing something else." I leaned forward. I was securing my place. I turned back to my father. "Remember when you needed capital for expansion in 2017? You signed over an additional 15% of your shares to me in exchange for my investment. And in 2019, when we had that legal battle, another 10% was transferred under my name as collateral, which you never bothered reclaiming. That, plus my original 35%, makes me the majority shareholder." My father's jaw clenched, but Ethan was panicking. "You have to be bluffing," he spat. I pulled out a second document. "This is the most recent legal filing with the state. Want to verify?" Ethan snatched the paper and scanned it, his face draining of color with each passing second. You can't do this," he stammered. "Dad, tell her she can't do this." My father remained silent, because he knew. I had legally outmaneuvered him, and there was nothing he could do about it. I exhaled slowly, standing up. "I'm not firing you, Ethan," I said. "I wouldn't want to force you into the real job market, but you will report to me, and you will work under my leadership. Otherwise—" I gestured toward the door. "You're free to leave." Ethan turned to my father, eyes pleading. But for the first time in his life, my father had no answer. No way to fix this, because this wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. The silence in my office was suffocating. Ethan still clutched the legal document in his hand, his fingers white from gripping it too tightly. My father stood rigid beside him, his expression unreadable, but I knew better. He was calculating, trying to find a way out of this. There wasn't one. I had spent years preparing for this moment. Not because I had expected betrayal, but because experience had taught me never to assume loyalty where power was involved. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me as if he didn't recognize me. Perhaps he never had. "So that's it?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice laced with bitterness. "You're just taking everything?" I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Taking everything?" I repeated, stepping closer to him. "Ethan, I built this company from nothing. Every contract, every expansion, every innovation. I made it happen. While you were busy failing upwards, I was keeping this company alive. So no, I'm not taking anything." I leaned in slightly. "I'm just keeping what's already mine." Ethan's face twisted in anger, but he had no rebuttal. He knew I was right. And worse, so did my father. He had spent years believing that bloodline mattered more than ability, that his son would inherit what was rightfully mine. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying for that mistake. My father finally broke the silence. "You're making a mistake, Lisa." His voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the strain underneath. "A family should stick together. Do you really want to burn this bridge?" I met his gaze head-on. "Dad," I said slowly, "you burned this bridge the moment you made your decision without me." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Business is bigger than just one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone." I tilted my head slightly, feigning consideration. "Oh, I agree. That's why I'm offering you both a choice." I turned to Ethan first. "You can stay in the company," I said, keeping my voice smooth, professional. "But you won't be CEO. You'll take on an advisory role with limited authority. Your salary will be generous, but you will answer to me." Ethan stiffened, but I didn't stop. "Or," I continued, "you can walk away. I'll buy out your shares at market value. You can take the money and find a new project to sink your teeth into." My father scoffed. "You're acting like you hold all the cards." I smiled. "I do." A thick silence followed my words. I let them sit in it. Let them feel what it was like to be powerless. Finally, my father exhaled, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "I never thought you'd do this," he muttered. Not to your own family. I felt a sharp pang at his words. Not to your own family. I wanted to tell him that he was the one who had done this, that he had made the choice to push me aside, to act as if I was temporary. But I didn't. Because in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't going to let them take what I had built. Not now, not ever. Ethan stormed out first. Good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to predict his next move. He would go to our relatives, our family friends, painting himself as the victim of corporate betrayal. I didn't care. I wasn't here to win their approval. I was here to win my future. My father lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, he gave a slow nod. "You've changed," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "No, Dad. I just finally stopped pretending." Then he left. I exhaled, sitting back down in my chair. I should have felt victorious. I had fought for my place and won. But as I stared at the empty doorway, I felt something else too. A quiet, lingering ache. A part of me had always wanted my father's approval. Some small, desperate part of me had thought that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself over and over again, he would finally see me. But the truth was, he had never really looked. And now? Now he had no choice but to see me for what I really was. Not his daughter, not his temporary stand-in. The true leader of Harper & Company. I turned back to my computer, my focus shifting. I had spent 12 years building this company. Now I would spend the next 12 making it untouchable. My father and brother had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who lost everything. For the first time in 12 years, my office felt empty. No phone calls from my father, no passive-aggressive emails from Ethan, just silence. But silence didn't mean peace. It meant the battle had begun. I knew my father wouldn't walk away quietly. And Ethan? He would fight tooth and nail to reclaim what he thought was his birthright. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. It had just begun. By the next morning, I could already feel the undercurrent of unease within the company. Employees who had greeted me with confidence last week now seemed hesitant, as if afraid to pick a side. A few department heads avoided eye contact. I knew what was happening. My father and Ethan were working the Whisper Network. Old family friends, board members, senior executives. They were sowing doubt, painting me as cold, ruthless, disloyal. Ethan, especially, had taken on the role of the wounded son, betrayed by his own sister. I could imagine him now, sitting in some high-end restaurant, fake sorrow in his voice, as he told our investors how I had stolen the company out from under him. And my father? He wouldn't need to say much at all. Just a heavy sigh, a shaking head, the carefully placed words. I only ever wanted the best for my children. It was calculated and dangerous, because if they managed to turn my board members and top executives against me, they could push me out of my own company, or at least make my leadership impossible. I wasn't about to let that happen. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. As I stepped into the boardroom, I felt the tension in the air. Half of the room avoided my gaze. The other half watched me too closely, waiting for me to slip. I took my seat at the head of the table. My seat. "Let's not waste time," I said, my voice even. I know there have been conversations, behind closed doors, over drinks, in hushed voices. I let my eyes scan the room, pausing on each person for just long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. I also know that some of you are wondering if my leadership is sustainable. A few people tensed. No one spoke. I tapped my fingers against the polished wood table. Let's clear that up now. I pulled up a presentation on the screen behind me. Numbers, data, facts. I built this company from a struggling regional business to a $75 million industry leader. Over the last 5 years, under my leadership, we've seen a 300% increase in revenue and expanded into 6 new markets. I turned to the CFO. Paul, do we have a single financial indicator suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership? Paul hesitated, then shook his head. Number. In fact, projections show another 20% growth in the next quarter. I nodded. So let's be honest about what's happening here. I leaned forward. My father and brother aren't upset because the company is struggling. They aren't upset because I'm failing as a leader. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Ethan take over, regardless of qualifications, regardless of results. The room was silent. Then I dropped the real bomb. I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my resignation. I tilted my head slightly. If anyone here would like to disclose those conversations now, this is your chance. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Then, after a long pause, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. I received a call, he admitted. From your father. He said he was considering making an official appeal to the board. I nodded, unsurprised. And did he offer anything in return for your support? A pause, then a slow nod. There it is. I exhaled, standing up. My father built this company, I said. I won't discredit that, but I took it further than he ever could have, and I will not allow him to manipulate it from the outside. I let my voice drop slightly. Controlled. Dangerous. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. I gathered my papers, looking at each executive in the eye. If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to make your move. Silence. No one moved. Good. I turned and walked out, my head held high. This wasn't just about keeping my company. This was about making sure they never thought they could take it from me again. That night, I made my own call. Not to a board member, not to an investor, but to the media. By morning, the business section of every major news outlet had the same headline: Power Shift at Harper & Co. Lisa Harper outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle. I had made my move. Now it was their turn. And I was waiting. The morning after my story hit the press, my inbox exploded. Emails, missed calls, messages from journalists, investors, and board members. Some were supportive, some were cautious, but most of them had one question in common. Is it true? I let them wait. I knew the game my father was playing. He had spent decades perfecting the art of public perception. He knew that reputation held weight in business. If he couldn't defeat me in the boardroom, he would undermine me in the public eye. And that was exactly what he was trying to do. By noon, the first counterattack arrived. A press release, neatly crafted, carefully worded, but filled with lies. Harper & Company has always been a family-run business. We are saddened by recent developments, but remain committed to upholding the values that built this company. Changes in leadership are inevitable, and we hope to transition smoothly as we move forward. It was subtle, but I knew what it was really saying. Lisa is reckless. Lisa is unstable. Lisa is not a team player. I wasn't surprised. I was, however, pissed. I sat in my office, watching the news as industry analysts debated my leadership. Was Lisa Harper too aggressive in her takeover? Will her lack of cooperation hurt the company in the long run? Can she recover from this PR disaster? They talked as if I wasn't watching, as if I wasn't already planning my next move. Because if my father and Ethan wanted a public war, I was going to give them one. I didn't release a statement. I didn't call a press conference. Instead, I made one phone call. To an old friend in investigative journalism. I have something for you, I said, but you'll need to move fast. An hour later, I sent over documents, emails, financial reports, internal records, evidence that Harper & Company, under my father's leadership, had engaged in questionable business practices over the years, ones I had spent the last decade quietly cleaning up. The story broke within 24 hours. Behind the scenes at Harper & Company, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover-ups. The article was brutal. It praised my leadership for fixing the company's financial health. It criticized my father's mismanagement from the past. And most importantly, it proved that I was the only reason Harper & Company had survived. And just like that, the narrative changed. The board stopped doubting me. The investors stopped hesitating. And my father? He had nowhere to hide. 2 days later, my father finally called me. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "Lisa," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "Do we?" Silence. Then, finally, a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I let out a small laugh. "Neither did you." "This company was supposed to be a legacy," he said. "For the family, for both of you." I felt a familiar pang. A tiny, foolish part of me had once wanted that too, but not anymore. "Dad," I said quietly, "if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me." Another long silence. Then he asked, almost reluctantly, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. Now I made sure they could never touch my company again. The war was over. My father had lost. Ethan had disappeared. And I had won. But as I sat in my office, staring out over the city skyline, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just emptiness. I had spent 12 years fighting for Harper & Company, building it, protecting it, making it stronger than ever before. And yet, the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I had expected. Because while I had secured my position, I had lost something else along the way. My family. The next day, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed. But everyone knew the truth. The whispers had stopped. The doubt had faded. I was no longer just Lisa Harper, the CEO. I was Lisa Harper, the woman who had outmaneuvered her father and brother and come out on top. Some respected me for it. Some feared me for it. And some still waited for me to fall. I let them wait. At noon, my father and I met in the conference room for what would be our final discussion. He looked tired, older, as if the weight of what had happened had finally settled on his shoulders. I waited for him to speak first. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I'm retiring," he said simply, "effective immediately." I didn't react. I had expected this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he continued. "I'll keep a small percentage as an investor, but I won't be involved anymore." I studied him carefully. "And Ethan?" His jaw tightened. "He's gone," my father admitted. "Took the buyout. He won't be back." A part of me had known it would end this way. Ethan had never been strong enough to fight his own battles. Once it was clear he had lost, he had done what he always did: run. Still, hearing it out loud made something inside me ache. Not regret, not guilt, just the finality of it all. I nodded. "Understood." My father exhaled, rubbing his temple as if he had a headache. Then, after a long pause, he said something I never expected. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I would ever get. And strangely, I found that I didn't need it anymore. A month later, Harper & Company looked nothing like it had before. The old board members who had aligned themselves with my father and Ethan, gone. The executives who had questioned my leadership, replaced. The company had always been strong under my guidance, but now it was truly mine. And with that control came a new vision. I introduced initiatives my father had always rejected. Modernized systems he had called unnecessary. Expanded into industries he had been too cautious to explore. Within 6 months, profits soared. Within a year, we had crossed the $100 million mark. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself. I was fighting to build something that no one could ever take from me again. A year after everything had happened, I met my father for dinner. It was the first time we had spoken since his retirement. He looked different, quieter. He wasn't angry anymore, just accepting. "I read about the latest deal you closed," he said over his drink. "It was a smart move." I smirked slightly. "I know." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. There was no tension between us anymore. No war left to fight. Only the simple, undeniable truth. He had tried to push me aside, and I had proved him wrong. He lifted his glass. "To Harper and Company," he said. This time, when I clinked my glass against his, I didn't feel anger or resentment. Only peace, because I had already won, and I no longer needed his approval to know it. As I sit in my office today, overlooking the city that I built my empire in, I think about the lessons this journey has taught me. That family can be your biggest enemy. That loyalty is a currency, not a guarantee. That power is never given, it's taken. But most importantly, that sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to stop seeking validation and build something so strong that they can never ignore you again. I have no regrets. Harper and Company is mine now, and I intend to make sure no one ever forgets it.